Hello and welcome to Soft Landing. I'm Roland Smith, and today we're going to look at how Britain is seen from abroad. We in this country can be guilty of being stuck inside our own British frame of reference and not seeing Britain, its features, culture and issues, as outsiders do. But how do outsiders see us? What is British political culture? It's not something we often think about. Now, to discuss all this, I'm delighted to be joined by historian, author and foreign policy analyst Dr Helene von Bismarck. Now, Helene is a specialist in British history and politics, particularly history of the Empire and British foreign policy in the 20th and 21st century. She's a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and a Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Her work has appeared in The Times, The Guardian and The Financial Times, amongst others. Now, crucially for us, Helene is a German living in Hamburg, so she is looking at our political culture from the outside, and furthermore, she has a newly released book containing her observations. The book is called Fantastic Kingdom, A Stranger's Notes on a Contrary Country. And that contrary country is us, the UK. Welcome, Helene.
Hello, thanks for having me.
No problem at all. I'm delighted to have you on here and speak at long last. So, there's a lot in your book, and I must admit I found it really fascinating. For me, it hit on some key truths that really slapped me in the face, because I hadn't properly considered them before. But I wonder if we can start talking about what the book is trying to do, then maybe look at our island story, which is a theme that comes through, and the politics that flow from that. And then we'll just see where the discussion takes us. But along the way, I must admit, I wouldn't mind just touching on the monarchy, which I confess I wasn't expecting, as I'm usually quite unmoved by the subject. But there you go.
I didn't have sort of one big message or one purpose I was desperate to tell. I think that's actually a problem of our discourse these days, that even books are supposed to be TikTok videos in the sense that we're supposed to break it down to a 2-sentence message. I think I should maybe explain that a bit from my background, because I am German, as you said, but I grew up in 4 different countries, none of them Britain. But I was, as a teenager already, very fascinated by English literature more generally, and by the language. So that is actually a very big theme of mine, which also runs through the book, the importance of language learning, and how that you just become a different person and you immerse yourself into a different context. So I started studying British history and the history of the Empire as an undergraduate in Berlin, when I was asked to write a paper on the Suez Crisis. And from then I was just completely hooked and fascinated by the history of the Empire and also its end. Then I wrote my master's on Britain and Iraq in the 50s, and then my PhD on Britain and the Persian Gulf in the 60s. As part of that, I started coming to Britain very regularly. And then being there and spending lots of time there, I was just no longer just intellectually interested, but I was also just really very happy. And it became, over a period of over 20 years now, my second home. After my PhD, basically until the Brexit referendum, I was very much a historian, very much an academic, so not participating in journalistic debates on anything. And then I gave a history lecture at King's College as a guest shortly before the referendum. There was an editor in the audience who said, "Would you ever be interested in writing about what's happening now?" And that's really what started me off as a commentator. And that's what I've been doing pretty intensely for the last 10 years. I think what defines my perspective is the combination of being a historian, a foreigner, but also somebody who has experienced your political system over the last 10 years.
That's fantastic. I mean, particularly diving into all this at the time of the Brexit referendum, because so many people want to know what really drove it in the British character and in our culture that landed us in this place. And obviously that's kind of the basis of your book, not the Brexit referendum, but that sort of broader look at our culture and how we think and why we think this way. I must admit, I'm very keen, as you might gather, to get onto the whole island story thing, which I know has been brought up by others, but nonetheless, I thought you made it incredibly engaging. You didn't labour points, you got straight to the points, some of which, as I say, slightly surprised me. So what do you have to say about the island story and how we see ourselves?
I think what's just fascinating about British political discourse, but also British history, is how this country is both insular and global. And that has obviously a lot to do with your history, but the whole book is about contradictions, how you can be 2 seemingly contradictory things at once. And one of them is obviously your geography. So your geography means you're apart from the European continent. It also means that you're really very close to the European continent. And when you actually take the trouble of studying your history in full and not the bits and pieces that suit your narrative, you just realize how this is very much the British condition, to be close to the continent, but apart from it. And lots of the tensions, also the political tensions within the UK, run from there. So depending who you're talking to, Britain is an island nation, which is completely separate from Europe, or it's a European nation, which just happens to be located on a group of islands, or it's no nation at all. It's actually 4 nations, one of which is not on the island. So each of these stories is true, but none of them is the whole story. But if you understand why this resonates and with whom you've basically cracked British politics, or not cracked entirely, but it helps. Before the referendum, those who advocated for it, people like Lord Hannon, for example, very much argued that geography defined Britain's character or identity. So basically, we're an island and hence we're un-European, hence we need to leave the EU. And what
he very much majored on the open seas, I always thought.
Very much. And the thing
very
is,
important.
Obviously, he's not entirely wrong in saying that the sea has obviously shaped your history. I would say that he sometimes sees the history of empire somewhat selectively. But of course, he's right that this is a big part of it. But it's obviously not all of it. What was fascinating and also quite disturbing after the referendum is just how many people, including many who completely disagreed with him about Brexit, jumped on that train. So this whole idea of this place is an island, hence it's exceptional, hence there was never any point of it being in the EU. Suddenly, lots of Remainers started to agree with that. And they started on some kind of negative exceptionalism. So you have the positive Rule Britannia crowd, and then you have the negative, we are just uniquely terrible crowd. And I think that these are really 2 sides of the same coin. One more point on that. What also really annoyed me, and that is one of the reasons I wrote the book, there were also plenty of Europeans, and not just Europeans, who jumped on that train as well, who bought into the whole exceptionalism story because everybody was so annoyed with Brexit that it was just easy to just say, oh, look at these little insular people, how self-righteous they're being, which in itself I would say is a self-righteous proposition, and without actually bothering to engage with the other reasons for Brexit.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've hit on something there, and you hit on it in the book as well, is that exceptionalism goes well beyond Leave supporters.
It does.
I think it cuts right through Britain generally. Just before we left the island story, though, there was a turn of phrase that you made in the book, which I just thought was perfect, which is that the sea is both a bridge and a border. It is the playground and it is our protector. And I just thought that turn of phrase was really lovely and captured it so well.
I've thought about this for a very long time, and it is, and honestly, to do that, I mean, I took some classes on Britain and European integration, and then later I worked on a project on Thatcher and Delors. But also for that chapter, I suddenly started reading Shakespeare, and Richard III, and this very famous monologue about the precious stone in the silver sea and so on. And then you realize that somebody like Boris Johnson, who very much pushed the island story thing, in his free time is writing a biography of Shakespeare. And you just see these connections and how deep they run. And yes, the idea with the sea being a bridge and border, playground and protector, it resolves the contradiction really, because how can this country on the one hand be so proud of its openness and its global history and at the same time so obsessed with how very different it is from everybody else?
That's what's so lovely about that phrase. It just captures it in just one very short sentence.
I would also point out that this is a criticism, it's just an explanation. That is the whole idea of the book, is trying to explain and understand rather than judge. I mean, if you look into your history and your literature and so on, you can understand where that comes from. And I think I say the island story is not like any myth. When you study literature, a myth is not a fairy tale. A myth always has a grain of truth to it, which is then embellished and turned into a story. And I argue in the book that the island story is not a lie. It's a myth in the sense that it's an embellished and romanticized version of the truth. And also that is why it works politically if you instrumentalize it.
And yet you can take it too far, as we've discovered, or as we know. The UK is not actually an island. And I've made this point before on previous episodes. We always forget about Northern Ireland, the English particularly. We are terrible at that. They're sort of an awkward add-on. And I know you've had some thoughts on Northern Ireland as well and its position.
Yes, the thing about Northern Ireland is that lots of cliches about what Britain is supposedly like or what Britain has never experienced no longer holds up once you consider that actually the country you're living in is the United Kingdom. Lots of the things you think have never happened in your history have happened. They have happened on the island of Ireland. I'm actually a little bit defensive of the English in the book, which may not win me points for popularity, because there is now this sort of a little bit coarse, basically the Scots and the Welsh are incredibly enlightened and the English are just generally very stupid and inward looking. I think that takes it a little far, and I also think it's not helpful to push that narrative at a time when the Union is wobbly and at a time when extremism is on the march everywhere in Europe. But I would say that it was fascinating for me to go to Belfast, fascinating and disturbing. I didn't sleep while I was there. I was really moved and shocked because I'd read every book about the Troubles and about Irish history. I'd interviewed people in Dublin and I'd been to Dublin. So I knew what happened, but then you go there and I think it's tempting to think, look, so there was this terrible thing and then there was a Good Friday Agreement, which is incredibly impressive. So happy end. And you go there and of course it is vastly better than what it was 30 or 40 years ago. But you can feel the conflict and the trauma and the disagreement and the competing worldviews literally under your feet. And also, by the way, it's remembered there in street art and in the murals there. I think that's where being a foreigner was actually helpful. I had a guide show me around the murals in Belfast. And this guy was, there's no other word for it, pretty much a hardline IRA sympathizer. So, and when you're a foreigner, they just try to convince you of their point of view without thinking that you're already on one certain side. Which also can be challenging because then you hear all these emotional and very personal stories and you go home to your academic books and have to make up your mind.
Yeah, no, totally. At least you've been there, though.
Yes.
And there's a huge number of English people who have never been there and they just don't get it. We don't get taught about it in schools. The only reason I know something about it is because of my age, and I lived through the Troubles and saw some of the bombings going off in London, which we lived just outside. But it's just not taught about. But you're right, you go there, you see it firsthand, you see the murals, you feel the tension, you see the flags here and there.
Yes.
And the curbstones as well, I always recall, the curbstones being kind of painted red, white and blue in certain areas. It does really impact you just going there.
Yeah,
the
flags were pretty... That somebody taught me that while I was there, that the flags are actually a way of marking territory. So they're not just there for decoration, but basically this is our area, know where you are. And I was thinking of that a year later when suddenly, last summer there was this whole raising of the flag all over England or parts of England. And it did remind me of that. Is there an element of marking a territory here now, suddenly?
Oh, I think so, definitely.
So that was pretty worrying. But then you say that, and then they say, oh, how could you ever compare anything to Northern Ireland as a special case? Northern Ireland is, of course, a very special case. But that is an element of, I think, insularity that you can find all over the UK. This whole idea that people get very touchy the moment you start comparing them to anybody, really. Doesn't have to be Northern Ireland, can be. So then very quickly the conversation is blocked.
Yeah. So there was another thing, just going back to exceptionalism as well, that you put in your book, which again sort of slapped me in the face. You were talking about Europe and European countries and how different they were.
Yes, from each other.
And then you said, from each other, absolutely. And you said, if Britain is the exception, then what is the rule? And it was such a well-made point, given that context of the difference across Europe. And it really sort of made me go away and think. But I did come back to something I've thought for some time, which is that the difference is the Second World War, which is that we won it, and we were never overrun by fascism. And therefore, why do we need someone else to tell us what to do?
I do think that the Second World War is incredibly important as a point of reference for how British politics play out today, also in a more recent development with regard to the United States, because the special relationship was basically born during the Second World War and has been the foundation of your defense policy for the last 80 years. So what's happening now with Trump's America is really a very dramatic development, also from a British perspective, but also for all Europeans. Yes, I'm German, so I'm from the country of the aggressor. So we have to be careful about generalizing about all of Europe. But what is true, that you look from literally from Spain to Estonia, you have a history of the 1940s at some point during that time being conquered, being displaced, having your institutions destroyed, and then having to rebuild afterwards. So this whole story of displacement, of, becoming a refugee, and of totalitarianism, first through the Nazis and in Eastern Europe, in some parts of Eastern Europe being occupied by the Nazis, and then the Russians came, the Soviets, I should say. So I think I say that at some point in the book, that there was never a Nazi or Soviet flag raised over Westminster, and that does make you different. I mean, thank God. I just don't want to come off as a German to say, just to be very clear, this is obviously a wonderful thing. But it does mean that, and that's quite understandable, why the whole idea of European integration as a peace project would be less salient in the UK than it would be in the Netherlands or in Luxembourg or in Poland, for example, let alone Germany. So I understand that. And I actually think one of the things foreign observers of the UK have always overestimated with regard to its relevance to Brexit is the history of empire. And what they've underestimated is the different experience of the 40s and also the special relationship with the US. I'm not saying that the empire is... I think it's very important to just realize how different. And also Britain was a sanctuary for lots of people who escaped this hellscape.
That's right. I mean, it is obviously great. We never had a Nazi flag or a Soviet flag flying over Westminster. A different side to that is we've never had a reset. A reset in our arrangements, our constitutional arrangements, how we view the world. So what you said about the European project doesn't have quite the same salience as a peace project because we haven't felt it in quite the same way. But I wonder if we've just not had a reset in the same way that European countries have been able to at least start anew, start afresh. It's not much of an upside, but anyway.
But that is generally your history. I mean, British history since the 17th century is in Europe very often taught as an example of an evolutionary system. So a system which gradually changed and not a revolutionary system. So Germany is a very special case in lots of ways. But also if you look at France, is now at its fifth republic. So basically things change and then you have a revolution and then you have a new system written down. And that your system couldn't be more different. That doesn't mean, if you actually take the trouble of studying it, that nothing has changed. But it just happened gradually and violence didn't really take place in England. So that makes it very different. Sometimes some things just seem a little outdated. But on the other hand, I would argue that these long lines of history could actually be a strength. If you are...
Wow, okay.
If you...
Just as we're starting to think they're not.
Yeah. No, the thing is, I think there is this tendency now to basically tear it all down and make everything different. And that's exactly what the Nigel Farages of the world are arguing. So I would, caution more liberal-minded people against this whole, why do they use ancient rhetorical forms in the House of Commons? Or why is it even in London? Or why are we even a monarchy? I think that lots of these institutions could do with an update, maybe. But I don't think right now, if we're talking about the problem that we all have all over Europe, which is a crisis of liberal democracy, a pretty serious one, the rise of extremist thought, polarization, and at the same time, a really very profound geopolitical crisis and a crisis of security, then I don't think the fact that your judges wear wigs or that you have a king is your big problem. I think it's actually distracting from more important issues, such as how do you build democracy in this time of sort of vast technological change? How do you even communicate with the public? I mean, what is the role of the media when everything is falling apart and fizzling out into different filter bubbles? How do you deal with an aging society? How do you uphold liberal democratic values in a multicultural society? All these things. And again, I don't think that you're quite quaint sometimes is not your big problem. And I know I'm going against the consensus with this. I surprised myself, actually, when I really thought about it.
It's fantastic. And that did actually come out of the book, I thought. I thought you were actually rather nice to us, given that we're kind of beating ourselves up at the moment over pretty much everything.
Yeah, that changed.
Because we feel everything's broken.
It changed during the writing process a little bit. I mean, I literally think of this country as my second home and I love it. And I'm never happier than when I'm there and I have plenty of friends there. And I honestly wasn't setting out to be the finger wagging, look, Germany is so much better. That was never my intention or message, mainly because I don't believe it. I think we have our own spectacular ways of messing up. We just do it differently. But I would say that I started working on this in late 2022. And while I was working on it in 2023, Biden was president. Rishi Sunak was prime minister. So Liz Truss was gone. And actually, British politics seemed to finally calm down a little bit after years of drama. The relationship with Europe was improving. This was before the beginning of the war in Israel and Gaza. So I thought, great, now everybody has calmed down. Now I can just write this calm analysis and we can have a calm discussion about the future and past of this country. And then while I was writing, everything just seemed to fall apart, especially last year in 2025. And just things accelerated again in a sort of even worse than before, not just in Britain, but also internationally. I just began to realize that what I just said, how the same people who 10 years ago said this country is just too wonderful to be in the EU are now saying this country is irrevocably broken. And that is Trumpism in a nutshell, because it basically means the country's broken, so please give me a little extra power to fix it. And that is the path towards authoritarianism. And the thing is, I mean, there is a huge problem. I mean, your two-party system is breaking down or changing into a five-party system. There is no money. That's actually the biggest problem of all.
Yes, I think so.
So there are lots of things that can improve, but this is still one of the richest and most stable and safest places to live on the planet. So let's just keep
nice to hear.
Let's just keep that in mind, you know, before you become too apocalyptic.
You said something there, and you did make the point in the book that, you know, Europe is facing these issues as well.
Yes.
This isn't just a unique British thing post the Brexit referendum.
Not at all.
That's somehow magically happening to us. So that's weirdly comforting. I shouldn't say that, but it weirdly is. And also just your view of the evolution that we should be undertaking of our constitution and our domestic arrangements rather than sort of ripping everything up. I thought it was interesting just on Broken Britain that Badenoch has actually pulled back from saying it's broken Britain. I think perhaps to put some space between her and Farage. But
I mean, the fascinating thing about Kemi Badenoch is that she just utters something with total conviction, and then 2 weeks later she says the complete opposite. So I'm not sure.
You noticed.
Yes, I noticed. But I never really know what to make of her because, you know, one day you might totally disagree with her politics, but she seems like a sort of reasonable person, and then just again says something either completely at odds with what she said the day before or something completely unacceptable, comparing the education to the Gestapo. You know, as a German, I take this rather seriously.
Yes,
that kind
quite.
of nonsense. So never mind. So
bizarre.
that's just Kemi Badenoch. But yes, the broken thing. Again, there are huge problems, but just be careful of what you wish for. That's all I'm saying.
Yes, absolutely. And I think I picked this up along the way, but one of the key things perhaps in our, I'm going to say brokenness, just for the time being, but I agree with you, I don't think it's broken, but is the first past the post voting system.
Yes.
Which just seems a bit of a problem. Also this idea of Britain being stable and moderate and all the rest of it, some commentators seem to link that to the first past the post voting system in the sense of, oh, well, you know, we could never have populism here. I mean, I've even heard people and read people saying that while Farage is stomping around. That's a bit weird, isn't it?
That is a long history. I mean, pick up a German history book about Britain from the 1990s and it would tell you just that it is historically very stable because of the two-party system. So this is a deeply ingrained view. I've thought a lot about competing systems. So here in Germany, we have this magnificent Grundgesetz, so our constitution, which was written mainly to prevent something like the Nazi tyranny from ever happening again. So there are all these kind of checks and balances and safeguards against totalitarianism. And it's a great document, but we still have, unfortunately, a very disturbing percentage of people who run after far-right parties. And in the US, you have this magnificent constitution, which any political scientist student around the world has studied as an example of ensuring democracy and liberty in a great theoretical text. And now you have the rules only apply as long as people care about them. When too many people don't care about them and the others are cowards, then it's relatively hard to enforce them. So I've come off the whole, let's just write our constitution down in one document and we'll be okay. It's not the rules, it's the culture. And the cultural problem is one we have across what we used to call the West. But on your point with regard to the voting system, that is the one thing I probably would reform. But it is true that the first past the post system, it doesn't build a two-party system, it reflects it. And so, so the system was there first. And if the party system disintegrates, which is a process which started 50 years ago, it didn't happen overnight.
Yeah.
This didn't start just now, and it didn't start with Farage. But in theory, it's a good idea. But very often when you have two candidates, people are going to vote for the one they like better than the other, not necessarily because that person represents what they want, but they just dislike the other one. But when you have five, it just becomes a game of chance, your vote, you know, what to do with it. So I would say that this is a problem. I would also, again, caution, changing this into a proportional representation is a massive change of the way British democracy works. I would not take that lightly. There is a middle ground, which is the affirmative vote, which does make a lot, which was discussed a few years ago, does make sense for me because it means you keep your constituency system and you still have the MP representing his or her constituency, but they would need to win a majority of votes and not just a plurality. So if there are 5 candidates, you can theoretically become the MP with 25% of the vote in your constituency, which is then not representative really. So the idea is keep the constituency system, but that person needs to come over 50%. This
is not the same as the alternative vote, is it? That we voted on.
But yes, it is. No, this has been discussed and dismissed before. So that's right, also, in 2011. That's one thing which is really funny about British politics is how everybody is moaning how the system needs to change and then somebody dares to try and make a change. And apparently there was once an attempt in the civil service to write certain rules down, and then immediately there was a huge pushback, like somebody is attempting a coup just by writing it down. So, and there was also once this whole stuff that's now being discussed with Andy Burnham and regionalisation. There was this idea of creating some kind of, you know, the north of England a few years ago to create basically to introduce devolution there. And there was a referendum and people didn't want it. So
yes, that's right. Yes. We do move in mysterious ways, us British. I must admit, the first past the post thing, though, years ago when we had the AV vote in 2011, I think it was.
Yes.
I think I was quite against AV, as many people were. And now I'm very happy to move away from first past the post because I just think it builds in divisiveness across everything. It makes us think binary. It makes the parties campaign all the time instead of actually governing, which is, I think, is a point you made in the book as well.
Yes, but I don't think the point is, I think that the voting system is no longer representative of the political situation on the ground, which is why you could argue that it needs to be modernized. But I never believed that the system created stability. I also don't think that it automatically pushes you into this whole binary thinking. I think the whole sort of social media, the way that reporting works, the way Westminster works, has more to do with it than the voting system. I think one big problem Britain has, and that is something which came up in every conversation. I also spoke to a lot of political scientists. I also spoke to quite a few people who'd been in the civil service. And everybody said, our big problem is short-termism. It's a very ugly word. So this doing whatever works in the moment without thinking through the consequences. And it's actually fascinating because if you study, for example, the history of devolution and Tony Blair's motives in really bringing it about, this was a huge constitutional change to create a Scottish and a Welsh Parliament. And I'm not criticising it at all. But when you actually study the history of how it came about, a massive decision was actually taken, not exclusively, but also because of some very short-term concerns of the Prime Minister. And you could say the same about the Brexit referendum or the Scottish independence referendum. Basically, David Cameron was panicking and thought he now had to do a Scottish referendum without actually consulting the civil service before he even made the announcement. And I mean, the country might have broken apart. When you think about it, the Scottish independence referendum was actually even more momentous, I would say, than Brexit. It's just because it didn't go that way that now people don't think about it anymore.
But isn't that a major flaw in our politics, that we just seem to stumble into these things? It's a short-term fix to something or another.
I think it is a huge problem and it's a huge challenge. And I think this does exist everywhere now because of technological change and because of lots of people say this is a problem that started in the 90s with a 24/7 news cycle. So if you think about Harold Macmillan, Prime Minister in the 1960s, the man used to, occasionally, when it was all a bit too much for him, he just used to withdraw, take to his bed and read Jane Austen for 2 days. He just took a break. I mean, it's always endeared me to him. I love Jane Austen. But the point is, that would be completely unthinkable. Now you have basically Downing Street ruled by tweets. Well, I'm not sure the tweets anymore, but this everything can be turned into a scandal in 5 minutes. And if that's the level of the political debate, and if politicians dance to that tune the entire time, it's literally impossible to make any sort of long-term plans for the future. And democracy is, by definition, a little bit short-termist because, every 4 years you have an election. So that is a compromise you make because any other form of government would obviously be worse. But now it's not 4 years, it's a next headline, which may be created by social media storm, which might start as we speak. Everybody says also in the civil service that this is a problem because if your career incentive is to change jobs every 2 years, because that's what gets you up the ladder, and if your career incentive is to be noticed by politicians who themselves are completely in hock of being noticed by the papers, then the whole point of the civil service is that they are supposed to think long term. But the way you structure it has impact on that. And I'm very concerned by the way in which now the civil service has become everybody's favorite villain. Whitehall is the problem. Nobody can tell you why.
Yeah, the blob.
And it's deeply populist nonsense. And it's the playbook of Trump and Elon Musk with their whole Doge project. And it's also, by the way, the tune of the German AfD. So this whole idea to politicize every impartial institution in the country is, I think, hugely dangerous. And I think it's a real problem. That said, I'm not saying there are no problems in civil service. Plenty of civil servants agree that there are. But the question is how you tackle those.
Of course. But just what you said on social media there, I wonder what you think about the media, never mind social media.
Yes.
Because I do think the media is part of the problem here as well, and that they should be more of an anchor in the national conversation than they are. I mean, they're just kind of kicking things off all the time and feeding social media, and social media is feeding them. And I don't know if we can do anything about that. That's the problem.
Technically, you have an anchor, actually very impressive and famous and historically renowned and internationally revered one, and that's the BBC. It's just the BBC has been systematically cut to the bones over a pretty long time and is now being attacked from left and right, which is really deeply depressing to me as a scholar and as a journalist. And as for the other media, I had one conversation about this with one of the people I interviewed who basically told me Britain has the best media in the world. And I said, right, this is interesting because this is literally the opposite of what anybody abroad thinks. I mean, it is true that honestly, the British tabloids especially are infamous internationally and have been for many decades. I mean, I've met people who lived in the UK, then came back to Europe and said they don't want to live there because of the tabloid culture. I mean, so they have a very bad reputation. That said, we also have tabloids, but yours are very famous. It is. Then this guy who said that you had the best media in the world said, you see, it's not that editors are intervening or anything. It's just commercial. This is what people want.
Yes, right.
And people want to read the Daily Mail and people want to read or the Mirror if you're left wing. So I said, so is this your idea of journalism, to print what people want to hear? And he said, well, that's capitalism. And I said, oh, great. That brings us back to public broadcasting and why you need it. That is actually a problem that now goes beyond the media, because you have somebody who prints whatever they think might appeal to the masses, and that is often the lowest common denominator. You have politicians who define representation not as being elected, who informs themselves about the issues, tries to make a plan, and then has to sell that plan to the public to get re-elected, but as somebody who basically just focus groups his ways through life and is just a sounding board for whatever, the majority wants at any given time, not every 4 years during the election. So it's a very passive idea of politics and a very passive idea of democracy. I don't mean to sound in any way elitist or something, but if it's no longer the job to politicians to inform themselves, for example, about the tax code and how difficult it really is, and then explain that to their constituents, and then maybe the constituents will say, you know what, I don't care, this is a bad argument, I'm still not going to vote for you, then that's your lot. But this whole idea that you shouldn't even explain anymore, I would say if it was so easy to just give endless money to the NHS, most politicians would probably do that, It's just that the money is not there. Or, for example, we don't want to spend money on defense. because people care about other things. At least you have to explain to people what the trade-off is if you make that decision.
I think that's exactly it. And I think there is very little political leadership in this country now. There's political followership.
Yes.
As you say, following
that
focus groups and constantly looking over their shoulder, like, are people still behind me? And if they're not, and if they're moving in another direction, the politician will move with them. And there just doesn't seem to be any strength of character to really level with the public about what the issues really are.
I think it is also very difficult because you get slaughtered for every half sentence immediately. And also I think you feel the contempt much more than you used to 30 years ago because everybody can just read it on your phone.
That's true.
An example I always think about is the German chancellor in the 70s, Willy Brandt. There is a very famous photograph of him kneeling in front of the gate of the Warsaw ghetto. So he visited Warsaw 25 years after the war, or 30 years, and he went to his knees basically out of shame for Germany's crimes during the Holocaust in Poland. It was an incredibly powerful thing to do, and it's in every German school book, and it has transformed the German debate about this war and about the Holocaust and everything. But at the time when he did it, 70% of Germans were deeply critical of that gesture. They didn't want their chancellor to kneel down in front of anyone. So he didn't do what was popular. He did what he thought was right. And this is an extreme example, but I remember reading this one book about Starmer coming in. It's called, I'm not sure, Get In or something by Patrick Maguire, one of these big...
Yeah, that rings a bell.
Yeah, one of these big, slightly sensationalist books which tell you all of the sort of Westminster intrigue and who had dinner with whom and who sent whom a text. And the thing is, you read 500 pages and you've actually learned nothing.
Yes, exactly.
Anyway, so you read that book and there's a lot about Patrick McSweeney in it because I think mainly because the
Morgan McSweeney.
Morgan, sorry. Because I think mainly because the author of the book doesn't like him. Anyway, according to the book, his catchphrase was, the voter is always right.
Yes.
Now think about this a little bit. I mean, first you would say, yeah, of course, that's the whole point of democracy. And then you think, actually, if the voter was always right, I'd never have to vote again.
Yes.
I mean, that's absurd. And if you're German, and you know the first thing about German history and that people actually elected the Nazis into power, this whole idea that the voter is always right, of course, they mean it differently. They mean that lots of people across the UK have felt disenfranchised for a very long time. And of course, that's a problem. And of course, you need to research what they want and listen to them up to a point. And I don't think that there is enough awareness in the UK across political parties that at some point there is a limit. Otherwise, democracy eats itself. And that's what brings us back to the whole it could not happen here exceptionalist thing. Because when you're German, you're very aware of that, you know, that there is a boundary at some point, must be a boundary. And the question is, where do you draw that line? But at least acknowledge that there should be one.
Yeah, absolutely. And parliamentary sovereignty was meant to be about that. We don't have referendums all the time.
Well, exactly.
So there isn't proper people sovereignty. You were meant to send your representative to Parliament and they were meant to use their own judgment once they got there on the issues of the day. But as you say, and I think you made the point quite strongly actually, social media has sort of broken that down because we are constantly voting on every move that our MPs and government make. And maybe that is what's changed.
I remember one thing during the pandemic or shortly after, there were all these leaked WhatsApps from different officials and so on.
Yeah.
And so somebody proposed to do something with regard to any kind of distancing or what to do. I can't remember what it was. But then the Prime Minister texts back, is this proposition based on focus groups or cabinet discussion? I just thought, okay, people are dying. And you're going to make the decision of who is allowed to visit a hospital based on what a focus group thinks? I mean, I'm not saying that they did it in the end. It was just a question. The whole point of political leadership is, so you have experts who give you evidence-based advice. You weigh the evidence and you make a decision. And of course, what people want also very much comes into the equation. But I'm sorry to be crass, but when you talk about extremism, or now anti-Semitism, which is a real problem in Britain, it's a real problem everywhere, and hatred against Muslims. So if the majority in, say, a certain area says, let's just kick all the Muslims out, is that then okay? Or let's tell the Jews to stop complaining.
But no, I think what you've described is the difference between governing and being blown around by the prevailing wind.
Exactly.
What voters just happen to think on that particular day. I wasn't going to raise this, but just the culture wars generally, because we've touched on social media. I mean, the culture wars, as they're named, have kicked off since the Brexit vote. Brexit being one of them, but it's gone way beyond that. Any thoughts on that and how that's being fueled?
I actually think Brexit didn't start this because, for example, if you look at the inside of the Labour Party and the whole Corbyn era and how social media played a huge role in inner Labour drama, which I think everybody, because of Brexit, everybody was very focused, myself included, on inner Conservative, inner Tory drama. And what sort of got overlooked is that the Labour Party was also battling with itself the entire time. But I do think that some of it is fueled by social media, but just generally there is a strong tendency towards polarization in the UK and towards oversimplified binary thinking in lots of issues. And it's not just Brexit, it's the empire, it's the church. Foreign policy used to be the one thing that was a bit exempt from that, but also that might be breaking down. And also as a historian, very frustrating to see how there is a strong tendency to look at the past as a story of heroes and villains.
Yes.
So it's all about were we the good guys or the bad guys, which any historian will tell you is a very irrelevant question. I mean, we're not in church. The past is not a morality tale. The whole idea of understanding what happened is to get a sense of where you are now and how that came about, but also to get a sense of perspective, that what seems obvious to you was actually completely different 50, 100, 500 years ago. And also to get some kind of insight into why decisions are being made, why humans act in the way they do. And instead, we have this whole, was Churchill a nice person or a bad person? Or was the empire 400 years of British history? You have one sort of camp which says, it actually really wasn't that bad. And other countries had empires too. And also it's completely irrelevant to today. So why even talk about this? And then you have the other side, which is basically the whole world is divided into colonizers or colonized. So even 3 generations later, you're a sinner or a saint. It's an incredibly unnuanced, crude view of global history and of imperial history. That is a real problem because obviously the empire is a huge part of your history and it ought to be discussed in a kind of rational and nuanced way. But I think I remember speaking to someone, I was interviewing him about religion in the UK, but we were talking also about this kind of Christian nationalism, which is very prevalent in the US. But there are some people trying to push this in Britain with limited effect, I would actually underline. It's very funny how... I
was just going to say, I don't think we're a very godly country.
No, not at all. It's a totally secularized country. But also, when you do go to church, quite a few of the people are among the most tolerant people I've met in the UK. I mean, I've met an Anglican minister who teaches religious study in Bradford to a classroom of half of his students are Muslims and a few are Jewish. And anyway, but what I was going to say, so this guy said, it's a real problem. We are talking about extremism. And he said, it's a real problem if people feel that their history is being maligned and if they're being told not to be proud of their country. And I just thought, number one, isn't this a little bit infantilizing that people are too fragile to just study facts in the past? Yes. And also this whole idea that you cannot love your country or be proud of your country because you know about its past is very strange to me. I fully accept that Germany is a very special case because of our horrible history. But this idea that somebody who knows about the slave trade would hate Britain is just utterly absurd to me. That said, there is a strand in the empire debate, which is, again, deeply emotional and also pretty unhelpful because it does actually push the whole, again, villains. It's not about understanding, it's just about taking sides, and that's a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I grew up mainly in the 70s.
Yes.
And I think the whole 1960s, 70s, and possibly going into the 80s as well, the education that we received about the empire, it was fairly sanitized, to say the least. And we had these things called ladybird books that would sometimes explain things. And it was all very lovely and sort of sepia-tinged about our role in the world. And of course, you also watch war films when you come home and it's all we're the heroes and we couldn't do anything wrong. And that's instilled into you when you're young. And Farage is, not far off my age. And there's just that whole generation of people who just think, well, no, why do you want to go back and upset everything I know?
Yes, but I would say that statistically, you have now, not just in Britain, I might add, you have this in Germany too. You have a lot of young people being attracted to right-wing. I mean, I'm not saying that what you just described as constitutes far-right, but there are lots of young people jumping on their train. So it's no longer just people's personal experience which is being challenged, but it's also just stuff being pushed on the internet and in podcasts. And I think that some of it may even be a bit of a backlash to the whole Black Lives Matter thing. So people were just outraged by the outrage because it sort of felt that what they believed in was being challenged in an unacceptable way or something. But again, I think that it's also underestimating the public a bit, because I think there are plenty of people, including lots of people who, for example, in the Foreign Office, they are very aware of the history of the empire in the sense that they don't have a rose-tinted view of it at all.
Yes.
So, I mean, we have it in a much more dramatic way in Germany now, that there are people who say, oh, why do we always have to talk about German guilt, and who are literally attacking our culture of remembrance and want to turn it all around and turn the Nazi tyranny into a story of German victimhood, which is very worrying. So history is a battleground, a very important one, but I don't think it helps to emulate what the far right is doing.
Yeah. Okay, just talking about rose-tinted loveliness. I wouldn't mind just touching on the monarchy a bit, as I think I said in the intro. And I think you captured it quite well in the book, is the British don't really talk about it that much, or we get a bit sort of shifty if we talk about it. I can't remember exactly how you phrased it.
Well, you don't talk about it to a foreigner, maybe amongst yourself. Basically, it's one out of two reactions. Number one is when you just bring it up in any way, somebody says, oh dear, and changes the subject immediately. Or you get a lecture, and with a very sort of tense look on the other person's face. And that lecture might be how terrible the monarchy is and how awful, blah, blah, blah. Or it might be how nobody understands just how wonderful and marvelous. But the point is, it's very defensive. Yeah. So nobody is relaxed about this. Okay. And what is interesting is how the whole debate about monarchy is basically driven by two groups. One is the courtier, which hat is which princess wearing at Ascot kind of people. Basically just, gossip, Tatler magazine stuff.
Yeah.
And the other side is people who want to abolish the whole thing. The thing is, they are not at all representative of the population, because around between 60 and 70% of the British people want the monarchy. Republic is an organization with less than 10,000 members. So the whole sort of public conversation about this topic is either deeply unserious because it's all, again, about cufflinks and hats and that sort of thing, or it's about bring it all down because a monarchy is a terrible invention. So what I try to do in my chapter on the monarchy is two things: look at it soberly, and also I think any conversation about what does the monarchy mean today is very much being cut short by the discussion, should it exist altogether? And the point is that's a totally academic debate, because that institution isn't going anywhere. So realistically, it's going to stay. So can we just talk about what it actually means to stay, how it works, what its advantages and disadvantages and flaws are? The other thing about your monarchy is it's the most British thing in the world. It's also a very global institution. So again, a big contradiction. And that is something which doesn't, that part of the whole, what it means internationally. Nobody talks about this in the UK.
No.
And actually the king is head of state in 14 other countries. And the monarchy is, not to be rude, but basically 95% of people outside the UK who know that you exist as a country know it because of your monarchy.
Wow.
So it's not irrelevant.
Right.
Yeah. So you can dislike it as much as you like, but it's a huge part of how the world sees your country.
They do see it favourably then?
No, not necessarily.
Oh,
totally depends on where you are. I mean, in Germany, for example, Germans, that's very funny. Germans are very fierce Republicans, myself included, in Germany. So if anybody tried this here, people would man the barricades. But Germans are also obsessed with the British monarchy. Your royal events are being broadcasted live on our public broadcaster for 8 hours.
Gosh.
The coronation, the Queen's funeral, and so on.
Doesn't seem to make sense, does it?
That's the whole point of the book, trying to resolve all these things which aren't very logical.
No, but I mean, even in Germany,
no, but we
Republican.
don't see this. as a celebration of monarchy, we see this as a celebration of Britain. To us, the two are the same.
Okay.
And that's obviously not an accurate view of the country, I get that. But the point is that the whole chapter, and actually much of the book, is about the power of symbols and why symbols matter, because lots of constitutional historians would explain to you that the monarchy actually doesn't have any more power because all the powers have been cut down very drastically over the centuries, and politically, theoretically, it's just a figurehead or a symbol. But the thing is, a symbol is not powerless. I mean, if everybody is watching, you have enormous influence. And what you do is inherently political. And the big problem and dilemma for the king and indeed the whole royal family is how you're supposed to be impartial and unpolitical at a time when absolutely everything is politicized. You know, to give you one example, the king is known to have a great interest in interfaith work and in different religions, and to be a very informed and very tolerant person. That was very interesting in some of the research I did, that in different religions, people all emphasized how important the king was in that regard, and to foster dialogue between different faith groups. And you could also see that at the coronation, you know, with the rabbi giving the king some of his regalia, and then a Muslim imam would do the same, and a Hindu leader. So you had really this idea of embracing all these different faiths into an ancient Christian ritual, which is very British, and I applaud that. I found it very impressive. And
I have to say, so I just have to say that just on the political point and the monarchy trying to avoid politics, I thought King Charles played an absolute blinder in front of Trump.
Yes,
when
exactly.
He visited the USA. I mean, that was extraordinary.
Exactly.
What he managed there.
And even before last year, when Trump was basically saying we're going to invade Canada tomorrow, and then the Prime Minister of Canada asked King Charles to give the speech from the throne in the Canadian Parliament, which technically is the right of the British sovereign, but a right which hadn't been used since the 70s.
That's right.
There are academic studies about what used to be called the White Dominions, so Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc., how they stopped using certain symbols and traditions in the 60s and 70s. Around the same time, Britain lost all its other colonies. So how they implicitly also joined this whole process of decolonization. Now they're bringing back the king. Why? To stake Canada's claim as an independent country. So they are defending their sovereignty against a president who is trying to basically lay claim to their country by bringing the British monarch back into their midst.
Yes.
At a time when people in the US are holding up signs, no kings, and they mean Trump with that. And then King Charles went to the US and gave a lecture on basically liberal, democratic, tolerant values. And the thing is, because Trump is just, apart from many other things, a huge snob and terribly impressed by gold and all this stuff, they listen because it is a king. But what the king is doing is defending democracy. So this is actually quite brilliant. And again, so symbols aren't unimportant. And while I was writing, I mean, he hadn't been to Congress yet, but he'd been to Canada. He'd also been photographed wearing a Canadian uniform on a ship on some kind of visit, and a Canadian Navy uniform, a few days after somebody in Trump's cabinet had repeated the claim against Canada. You can, of course, argue Trump is not going to stop because of anything the king does. And fair enough. I'm not sure any of us can stop Trump by persuasion, but I would say that what the king did there is important with regard to the UK. Because he used his platform to defend liberal and tolerant values at a time when these values are also very much under attack in the UK.
Yes.
But obviously the British press doesn't report it that way because they are too focused on, which cufflinks anybody is wearing. But that's another issue.
Yes, of
and
course.
In the Caribbean, for example, the whole question of slavery. And there was one of the Caribbean Commonwealth realms which chose to become a republic a few years ago, and others may follow. So, and that's what I'm trying to lay out in the book. It's completely stupid to try and reduce this as a neat positive or neat negative thing. But I would say it's a relevant thing, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, really interesting, really interesting. I'm conscious we probably need to wrap this up.
Yes.
But I just want to ask you one other thing, because you quoted Dean Acheson with his famous quote.
Yes. Oh dear.
About Britain losing an empire and not finding a role.
Yes.
What is the UK's role in the world in future? Do we need a leadership role? I know we always think we need to be a leader. How do we position ourselves?
Well, I hesitate to tell you what to do, but I would say that what you need is a discussion about this. At the moment, the UK is incredibly inward-looking, or that's how it comes across. So it is fascinating and deeply worrying to see how the whole British discourse is consumed by domestic politics and discussions about, I don't know, the NHS and Andy Burnham and isn't Manchester a better capital at a time when I live in Hamburg, and 1.5 hours from here at the Baltic coast, a friend of mine lives, and he has Russian drones flying over his head at night. And there are NATO maneuvers happening in his backyard. Go to Estonia, go to Norway, go to Finland. Everybody is incredibly concerned about the fact that the transatlantic alliance is dying or on life support at a time when you have a completely unpredictable Russia. And the thing is, at the moment, Russia has the disadvantage in Ukraine. That might change again. But the whole idea that even if they lose, or at least if they don't win, that doesn't necessarily make them less dangerous, because also what happens if that country implodes and what might the consequences be for its neighbors. So first of all, I think what the UK could use, I feel like the preaching German, but you need to recognize that the world has changed in a way that it hasn't changed in 80 years. And you need to position yourself. And instead of saying, was it a good idea to leave the EU or a bad one? I think it's a bad one. But the point is not, what should we have done differently 10 years ago? But there is a new situation now. And what do you do? And the fact is that there was a defense review coming out last September, which now caused the most enormous fuss because, as it turned out, they hadn't probably costed it. And then the Prime Minister couldn't find the money for it and so forth.
Yes.
But that review actually says, in a very subtle British defence official kind of language, that the post-war order is breaking down. And there are two maps in that thing. One is about British energy dependency on specifically Norwegian energy.
That's right. Yes,
and basically a huge part of your energy comes from Norway has a border with Russia. The second map shows your food dependency on food imports from abroad, particularly from Europe. I mean, you get almost half of your food from abroad. So this whole, let's just, pull the drawbridge up because we don't really feel like engaging with the world. It's just not a very realistic scenario. And this whole idea of what security is, people think that war is when a tank crosses your border. But the fact is you can suffer greatly from a war that you're not part of. And where all this talk about there is a cost of living crisis, there is an energy crisis, prices are too high. Yeah, where do you think that comes from? Ukrainian cornfields are a huge part in global food supplies that have been disrupted for the last few years, and energy is being traded on global markets. And again, this war and also wars in the Middle East, now in Iran, a huge role in how you live somewhere in, I don't know, Bradford or Hull or wherever. So this whole idea, we'll just take care of ourselves and foreign policy is some kind of luxury pursuit, is a bit absurd.
And very interesting. It does remind me a little bit of something that was said in the 1950s. I think it was a government report, I can't remember the exact date, where they basically said we were in danger of being beaten back onto our island where we shall starve. And that was kind of the prognosis of why we needed to move and engage with Europe, which, obviously that was a very live debate back then. But look, I'm going to have to wrap this up. It really has been very fascinating. Thank you so much for joining me on this. Really, really interesting. And anyone listening, please do look out for the book. So that's by Dr Helene von Bismarck. It's Fantastic Kingdom, available in all good bookshops now. I think it just was released only about 2 weeks ago, actually.
2 weeks ago, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So very hot off the press. Please do read. Very, very incisive view of who we are. But Helena, thank you again. Great pleasure to have you on. And, we shall keep watching, I have no doubt, this strange and interesting and contradictory country. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.